So, but I assume you can all hear me? Everyone can hear me? I guess that's a kind of really stupid question to ask because if you can't, don't really know that I asked a question. So, all right, I have a bunch of stuff that I want to talk about, and I'm going to kind of be pulling up random files and stuff as we go here. But the main thing that I like to do is actually have a conversation, and so please be thinking of questions. They can be pretty, tangentially off of the stuff that I'm talking about. I bring tons and tons of material, just past work of mine and stuff like that, so that I could kind of modularly move where we want to go. And so please don't be shy. So obviously, how many of you are actually in the orchestra that'll be playing tomorrow? Probably most of you, right? Yeah, almost all of you. So obviously then, you know firsthand that I write music, and I am a composer.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah, where am I? But actually, I don't think that that's what I do. I would say that I am not, it may appear that I write music for a living, but I actually don't regard what I do as that. Instead, what I do is I basically use music as a tool to try to manifest the world in which I want to live. Now, I know it sounds like it's probably bullshit, but it's not, I promise. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through my line of thinking on that. So the first thing to ask, which strangely, I actually ask myself every time I try to even sit down and write music, I kind of end up in this weird existential crisis where I'm immediately confronted with the question of what even is music? And I don't know that there's a totally obvious answer to that, but I've kind of come up with a handful of things that seem to sort of overlap and address it. And the most fundamental of those is that simply music is storytelling. I also would argue that all human behavior is storytelling. Every single thing that we do is about communicating information and intent and idea. Even something as fundamentally primal as like having kids is a form of storytelling and the transmission of information, in that case genetic information. But music is somehow different than all other forms of storytelling. And the one way I like to put this is that all the arts, theater, architecture, game design, and no, I will not have a discussion about whether or not that's art, filmmaking, being a novelist or a poet, etc., to all things, those to me are all perfect examples of why humanity is awesome. That we do all this crazy shit and it's really inspiring. Music I would not put in that category. It's the sole art that I don't think is an example of why we're amazing, because I don't think we invented it. We invented all those others. We invented sculpture and we invented architecture and whatever. But music is actually basically just a phenomenon of acoustical physics that we've kind of gotten increasingly clever at rearranging to our own end. And so I think of it, it's almost like beavers making a dam, where we're not synthesizing the material that we're using, we are just kind of rearranging things that are at our fingertips, in this case, audible sound. And that, to me, implies that music actually comes from sort of a more primal place than humanity itself, because we didn't invent it. It literally is already part of nature itself. And so when I ask myself, like, why is it that people can listen to a piece of music? It's literally just vibrations in the air, and yet it can make them cry, or can make their heart beat faster, or slower, or feel whatever. How is it that it can have that effect on us? And I think that part of the answer to that is the fact that it's sort of nature itself, and we're just sort of bending it to our desires. So I have a piece of music that I love to play. Being that so many of you here are musicians, you might very well know this piece already. It's from 1630. It was written by I'm going to pull up an image that's going to be super random looking. It was not written by this guy. I have no idea who this guy is. The piece is called the Miserere me Deus, written in 1630 by Gregorio Allegri, and it's a setting of Psalm 51, and there's a great line in there. I say great line. It's a great line of text, which is in Latin, amplius lava me ab iniquitate mea, which means cleanse me of my sin or of my iniquity, which to me is like the most boring piece of poetry ever. It's no different than being like, you should brush your teeth before you go to bed. Like, it's really quite dull. But in the hands of a composer who doesn't feel that way, it can be something else. My sound has been... I don't care what your sort of religious beliefs are or aren't or any of that sort of thing. To me, it's pretty impossible to not feel something from that. And mainly because I think Allegri really felt something. Now, how many of you knew this piece already? Probably it's quite a famous piece. One of the things that makes it famous was that, and this is all just totally a tangent because I'm just a nerd and I like this piece. It has nothing to do with anything, but this piece was considered very holy. It was considered to be divinely inspired, and so it was forbidden to perform it outside of the Vatican for quite a long time. Obviously, the BBC was not in fraction of that by the time this video was made, but for a long time, it was literally illegal to take it out of the Vatican, and you know, this was back in the day where they had the parts and that was it. So they therefore controlled distribution. And then one day a young whippersnapper came wandering in there, heard the piece, was blown away, and he was a child prodigy musician, probably the most significant of all history. And so in one hearing, and mind you, the piece is like 20 minutes long, and what you saw was the antiphonal choir. There's a full choir on stage, and then there's another antiphonal choir that's on a balcony, which is where that clip demonstrates. So it's a more elaborate piece even than what you heard that little bit of. And so this kid memorized all of it by ear in one hearing and carted off back to Austria, wrote it out, and then years later visited the Vatican. And they said, Mr. Mozart, it's such an honor to have you here. Is there anything we can do for you? And he said, I'd actually love to check the score and see if I got it right. So he, of course, did, and therefore he's the history's first music pirate. So, for those of us who like to get all in an uproar about people trying to share their music, just know it's coming from a place of love. But so, point being that the words amplius lava me ab iniquitate mea basically have no meaning, but music gives them meaning. And it can access emotions, and you can attach individual personalized meaning to those words because music is like this gateway for you to do that. And this is not something that any of us are unfamiliar with, because about a little over 100 years ago, new technologies were invented that immediately took advantage of this sort of psychological phenomenon. It started when early projectors, courtesy of our friend Thomas Edison, were, you're all, I assume, friends with Thomas Edison. He invented the ability to project images in a rapid succession, and thus creating a faked simulation of movement, and thus movies were born. And you know, you think of the old, you know, like the girl in the train tracks kind of, silent theater era with the pianist accompanying the movie in the actual theater. Now, the assumption would be, that's how film music was born, and what an incredible creative instinct of theirs to say, well, we should have music in this. Why would they have thought that? It's actually really stupid. Does anybody know? Does anybody know why there was a pianist in the room? Because it's a very pragmatic thing. It is absolutely not creative,
Does it have to do with timing out?
Nope. It is literally because the technology of the projectors was still really rudimentary, and they could only be so far from the screen, which meant there was no projector booth, which meant they had a really loud and obnoxious piece of equipment sitting in the theater with you. So they were like, oh God, anything to just cover up this horrible sound. Just, throw Johnny in there on a piano. And then it's like, as soon as the guy started playing, literally anything, the footage suddenly had new meaning. And they were like, there's something to this. Eventually whole orchestras would be in the big prestigious theaters would have literally like pit orchestras, almost like a Broadway show in the theater. And it's actually, as soon as the talkies were invented, it was a very contentious thing, because tens of thousands of musicians nationwide all suddenly lost their job because now you didn't need a live ensemble anymore. So point being, filmmakers from day one discovered the power of music to completely transform your perception of what the meaning and emotional ideas of an experience are. And so even though you all already know that, because I assume you've all seen at least a movie, I'm going to show you anyway. So here's a film that I did that hasn't come out yet. In fact, what you're looking at is my composer print, where it's not color corrected and there's not finished sound design, and there's time code on the screen, which presumably wouldn't be part of the final release copy of the movie. And so, assuming you guys can see here, this is a scene. This movie's an adaptation of a Dostoevsky short story called White Knight. And what has happened is, up to, you can see in time code, this is 11 minutes, or almost 12 minutes into the film. So we're still at the very beginning of the movie. And this guy witnesses this girl get mugged, and her purse gets snatched, and he goes running after the guy and gets the purse back, and then when he goes to try to bring it back to the girl, she's gone. So he opens it up and he finds her driver's license, or he finds something to identify her address, and he goes to take it to her, and as you saw at the beginning, he comes walking up to the house, and she steps outside, and he's nervous, he's got a little flower, and he's clearly not accustomed to being around human females. And so he discovers, to his shock, she walks up and she doesn't see him, and he's like, hey, she's blind. And she just goes walking by, and she's kind of weird and dragging a chair, and everything about it is just odd. So we're not really sure what to do. He just kind of starts stalking her and following her through Los Angeles, and we have this charming little montage of him, following her through the city. And as you can see, it's a sequence which the director always planned on being driven by the music, because there's not a hell of a lot happening that would take the place of the dramatic spot of music. Some are very much wondering why there's a girl walking through the streets, and this is what's fun about actors who really take what they do seriously, is they're just absolutely I'm walking through the middle of the street like a blind person, and you get all kinds of great little background extras. So, point being, he's following her, he doesn't really know what's going on, she does this really odd thing with this envelope, and then they are, it reveals to be at the steps of the fictitious African nation of Magumbai, the People's Republic of Magumbai. And then we end up with this wonderful sort of fairy tale tree. Now, out of curiosity, for those of you of musical proclivity, what do you hear in your mind while watching this footage? What kind of music would you write for this? Yes, to to the composer in row 3.
I hear that Jewish music, the klezmer clarinet, just like boom, boom. Yep. Slower, like really.
Not at all what I wrote. But you know, it would be an interesting approach for sure. This is what's fun about montagey kind of sequences is there's a wide gulf of what could work. Yeah.
I hear horror movie music.
Horror music. You know, that would actually be very easy to simulate. What kind of situation do I have here on this thing? Do I have any kind of bad strings? Good. Nice, you know. That's like different generations horror music. No, it's true that. Now, of course, the film flies in the face of this approach because it's all these bright colors, and he's clearly a very sort of innocent, almost childlike character, but nonetheless, you know. Now, if it was like Bernard Herrmann, you know, you would have, you know, like. Would have sounded a little bit better with real strings, but you all didn't bring your instrument? All right, so.
I could play what I did.
So here's what I did. Now, of course, I'm obviously setting you up in an unfair way because you have no idea what the hell the rest of the movie involves, and that's very important when deciding what to do. Because, and I'm going to get to this a lot later, a big part of what storytelling is an awareness of not only what's happening right now, but how that fits within a larger whole. And so it's all about thinking in terms of arcs nested within larger arcs. And so in this case, the overall arc of the film, it's a very sort of romantic film, except that every character in the movie is a complete idiot. And so it's very funny, but it's very sweet. And so we wanted to make the film feel like it exists outside of time in a way. So I wrote the score in a very, for lack of a better term, it's a Chaplin-esque, like old Hollywood score. So I have this little theme that goes. Very, very old-fashioned, you know. Now, how I orchestrated that is for orchestra, and you can hear it's very waltz-like, but then I also feature a harmonica soloist, which to me perfectly had the childlike sort of innocence that this character really needs. Because even though he's stalking her, he's like a little kid, basically. I like to show this because, you know, most of you are musicians, and so the notion of imagining this another way is not a huge sort of far cry for you, but I often speak to people that don't know that everything I'm saying is highly highly novel to them, and so it's always fun to kind of blow their minds with what. Yes.
The music that I heard in there, it kind of reminded me of France for some reason.
There is a very kind of French aesthetic to a lot of the score, including I actually weirdly play accordion, and I play a lot of accordion in exactly that vein in other parts of the movie, so you're definitely it's not meant to be French in an overt way, but that just kind of weaseled its way in there. Plus, I mean, some of my favorite composers were French, and so I think it's just kind of an omnipresent influence of mine. But it's not specifically trying to be so much as just an old-fashioned kind of romantic. You know, it's out of time. You know, it's not meant to feel retro. It's meant to just feel like it exists literally outside of time itself. So to really prove though this point of music's ability to sort of crawl into your head, this is sort of one of my favorite things ever. This is the same exact scene with the Dark Knight. You totally jumped me, jumped the gun on this one.
Changes every day.
It's not the same footage. There's got to be a way to make this loud.
Yeah.
Colored boxes.
Yeah, there you go. And then
What is
just hold it down, yeah.
1%. Now see, when I watch this with this music, to me what's interesting is that it raises all these questions. Like, is she some terrorist and he's like the superhero who's waiting for his moment to save everybody? Or exactly, is he this crazy like Jack the Ripper who's about to totally splash this music?
Oh, that's not what now she's crazy.
I like this nice swell.
Now she's
So clearly we can all appreciate music's ability to radically recontextualize what the footage is specifically after, insofar as music will recontextualize what anything it's accompanying is after. And so as a composer, obviously, it's very important to understand that because your whole job is knowing how to drive that relationship. And so that's kind of like broad point number one. The second big thing is music has built up a couple of thousand years worth of like traditions and icons, or you can almost think of them as tropes, where we have kind of like these codified ideas that are established, like in there, you know, hearing the waltz, you know, like in this kind of, you know, descending chromatic little bass line. Things like that are little like flags pinned into the map where you just know what that means. And so as a composer, the next big thing you have to always be aware of is how will someone read this? Because how will this overlap with something that they are familiar with? And so I think of that as kind of like managing these icons. Now it's one of those things that it can be your worst nightmare, because if you just mindlessly plow into that, you're going to write music that's very generic and has absolutely no soul to it, and it just is sort of heartlessly recreating stuff lots of other people have done before you. But if you really work hard and focus on trying to identify what those core sort of genetic strains are within those tropes and icons and kind of codified gestures are, you can extract them and use it to your purpose. So I'm going to walk you through a few things that I've done to show you kind of what I mean and just how I've dealt with this. Now again, this is not me saying that therefore it is the way. I would never try to sell myself as anything. This is just how I've done it, but it could all be terrible. For those of you who were in the orchestra last year, you may remember playing this. That is obviously like the simplest thing ever written. It's like not even anything. But that's Flow, the PS3 game Flow. It was my first major video game release, which was a crazy story. I was at USC, and most all of you are in school, right? You're actually taking classes right now, either graduating soon or in some later year. So then this can sort of mutate into just from being a weird little story into being hopefully like maybe food for thought on how to go about your futures. Because I am a big fan of always going through life as flypaper and maximizing every opportunity for anything interesting to happen, and by just not repelling anything. And I wasn't aware that this was how I thought, but then I had this chain reaction of events occur that ended up changing my life, and it was simply by just blindly being like, hello, like Forrest Gump on the bench talking to random strangers. And so my version of that was that once I was at a concert, it was at a choral concert at USC, and I don't remember what I had going on that day, but I didn't want to be there. I was like, and it was probably something stupid, like I gotta log into StarCraft. But I was nonetheless like feeling very impatient. So I sat in like the very back, like aisle seat of the last row. So I was as close to not being there while still being there as possible. But of course, once the concert started, I was totally into it, and I was happy to be there. And then I happened to notice next to me, there's this guy. He's like G.I. Joe sitting next to me, and slightly, for a concert of like 16th century madrigals, he was not who I expected to be sitting next to. And so I turned to him, of course, and he was like, "Hi, why are you here?" And I should have seen it coming. He's like, "Oh, the soprano, blah blah blah. I'm dating her." And I'm like, "Oh, right, of course, that makes sense." So we just start chatting. And it turns out he was an ROTC student, but he was at USC studying game design. So of course I'm like, business card. I'm a composer. I love games. I've been a gamer longer than I've been a musician. And I've never done a game. I'd love to do a game. And I did stuff like that all the time. And most of the time you never hear from the person. But in this case, the guy actually called me a couple days later. It's like, hey, what's your website? There's some cool stuff. And I'm actually doing a game right now that I got to finish soon. And I'd love to have you write some music for it. So it was basically Pac-Man that he had reskinned being an ROTC student as like this military thing, where instead of like Pac-Man, you were like a tank. You could lay mines and stuff. But it was essentially Pac-Man. And so I wrote a very like, sort of techno orchestra thing, and play, put this little, the game is a student project, so it was 5 minutes of gameplay that had maybe a minute of music. But it was like, I have arrived. I am now scoring games. And to my amazement, we got along great. His name was Steven, awesome guy, and we hung out a bit. And then one day, out of the blue, I get an email from one of his classmates who says, I'm working on my master's thesis, and Steven recommended you as a composer I should get a hold of, because I don't really know what to do about this. Well, that student's name was Genova Chen, and the game he was making was called Flow. And it was his master's thesis. And so I went to meet with him. I had no idea what to expect. Just given the omnipresence of things like Halo and whatever, I was like, he's going to want some huge orchestral, bombastic. For those of you familiar with Flow, you can imagine my shock when I saw the game that he was making. But I was also immediately in awe, and I was like, this is a guy that doesn't want to make games like anyone else. And so we of course got to talking, and I was like, I'd love to do this. And so he said, well, great, let's get started. What do you have in mind? And of course I thought, I have no idea. Because it seemed like it needed something very ethereal, very gentle, very kind of sweet, but in a very almost surreal way. And the gameplay, he was studying a thing called flow theory by a Hungarian named Csikszentmihalyi, who had developed this sort of principle of studying like are you guys familiar with flow theory? Have you ever heard of this concept of where you look at a graph and on one axis you have frustration basically, and on the other axis you would have difficulty. And so he's all about exploring these dynamic systems where if things get really hard, you engage like really hardcore players, but then you start to lose people that get frustrated easily. But then if you swing too far the other direction, you quickly become too boring, and no one's interested. So he is all about studying kind of the psychology of the interplay between those two, and Genova was fascinated by that and wanted to make a game that dynamically just adjusted to whatever you were doing. And so in Flow was a game, yes?
Is his name really Genova?
No, but it's something that no Westerner can pronounce. I've seen it on his driver's license, and it's like X's and Q's, and I'm totally incapable of. I've never actually even heard him say it either. I'll give him a call right now. But no, he Genova. I mean, I think he legally can sign things by that name. So I think because he's he did immigrate to the U.S., but grew up in Shanghai. For those who don't know what we're talking about, I started. It seemed intuitively like it needed to be or electronic music, which I had never done before. Never like this. I had played around a little bit, but I grew up, like in high school, I was, conducting the high school orchestra, and I was always writing music by hand, and I had come from this very kind of organic, non-technical background, despite the fact that I was also taking like C++ and HTML and Java programming classes, because I was actually thought maybe I would want to actually be a game developer in college and not a composer. So even though I was like a huge computer nerd, I never actually combined that with music until I got to college. And so in hindsight, I'm like, well, that's like a form of schizophrenia, I think. So anyway, long story short, well, long story's long. I knew that I wanted something really simple, and so that very, very rudimentary. It's not really a melody. It's just a chord progression. Started to kind of emerge as the sound I was after, but I knew I wanted no hard edges. I didn't want traditional instruments. It needed to feel very amorphous, and so I started playing around with my gear, not really knowing what the hell I was doing, and this of course is the PlayStation 3 version that we made after the master's thesis student version. But you can hear the way in which it translated into the final game. And so when I was talking before about having an awareness of these like tropes and these kind of musical symbols of a sort that we are all aware of, the fact that it's electronic means that no instrument is going to imply any kind of cultural baggage, for lack of a better word. It's not going to tip it towards any one particular sort of cultural idea. It lets it stay emotional in a kind of neutral way. And then also the types of sounds. Incidentally, I also ended up doing all the sound design, which is, I'm not a sound designer, but in this case, in the game, music and sound are not different concepts from each other. The whole game is music. And it's all interactive. Every single thing the player is doing is changing the music. And it's the first time I'd ever been interactive music also. That's, by the way, this was the second sort of creature, which we refer to as the jellyfish. opening of Petrushka. But no one has ever said, like, hey, I noticed that there was a Petrushka. You have to be very unhealthy, I think, to make that attachment, but it wasn't there. So, point being, though, it's I had to kind of be aware of what these sounds are going to naturally evoke, and hopefully by creating sounds that you've never really heard before, you may have heard things kind of in a similar sort of vein, but by making something that's hopefully quite new feeling, I'm able to carve out a little space that has a sort of neutralness to it, which was essential for the game. Now, the diametric opposite of this would be a game that just came out last week, where I wanted to play around with a very familiar musical trope, which is what I already kind of hinted at before, the silent movie theater, sort of thing. And so for this game, this is Monaco, which came out on Steam literally last week, and after 2 years of work on my part, it took Andy, the developer, 3 years. This game is a heist game. It's a top-down heist game that, his little joke is it's Hitman meets Pac-Man. And it's a really, really excellent, incredibly fun, addictive as hell game that you can do as a co-op thing. And so this was actually his idea, which is not surprising because he's familiar with musical tropes. And so he said, you play a criminal in this game. This is a heist game. But I don't want the music to cast aspersions on you as a character. You shouldn't appear to be evil. So we need music that feels, and the word he loved to use was naughty. Which has a very childlike quality, I think, to it. I don't think of naughty as, there's just no amount of seriousness that you have a serious ceiling with that word in terms of how dark, that really can get. And so it had to have that vibe. And so I wrote this simple little theme that goes like this. And, very and the whole game, start to finish, is all solo piano, literally silent theater style. So this was a little trailer that this is old, so the gameplay actually has progressed a bit in terms of its prettiness, but this is a thing that we made last year. Even, for example, the sound of the piano, I don't know how kind of audible it was, that it's like an old shitty upright piano that's semi in tune that I sampled for this game. And so that, even that, when we hear that sound, when we hear that color of that piano, it has a certain thing that it instantly evokes for us. And so that's in the same way that, if I want to write for a big orchestra and choir, that is going to have a certain built-in automatic understanding of kind of what that means dramatically. These are all the things that a composer basically trades in. Here's another example. I did a little iOS game last year called Horn that no one bought, but it's an excellent game. I do highly recommend it. It's on iPad and iPhone, Android. And it was the first mobile game to ever record a live orchestra, and it's an adventure game. It's almost kind of a Zelda style adventure, and so for this one, the premise of the game is that you're this little kid who wakes up one day with amnesia in his village, but for some reason he can't explain, has no explanation for. Like thousands of years have passed since his previous memory, which was theoretically like moments before. But somehow thousands of years have passed, and all the buildings are like in ruins, and every single person is long gone, and there's these giant like stone creatures in their place. And so the game is you trying to sort of suss out what has happened, and try to hopefully save things. And so it's a very kind of simple but really well done narrative. And you at the very beginning of the game, it has almost it had almost kind of a Pixar quality to it, where you fight, like the first guy you fight, he's like one of these stone guys, and you cut his head off, and his head is just basically on the ground talking to you like, hey, like, you ass. And so the character like puts it on his belt. So throughout the game, this thing is like taunting you, and it's like the voice acting was great. I really liked it. So I wanted it to, it had to have an adventurous quality, and it had to have a light on its feet. The game is not, it's not super heavy, but it did need to have a melancholy about it, because you are like walking around amongst the, potentially everyone you've ever known is dead. And so it's not a super serious game, but it did need to have that undercurrent of melancholy. But I also really wanted it to be, it needed to be light on its feet. And so it's a very top-heavy orchestra. I have way, like relative to what you would normally balance, I have way more violins than cello and basses, for example. And then I also put a penny whistle section in the orchestra. So I have 4 people playing penny whistle, and then a bunch of other stuff. And so the theme goes like this. Very simple. So here's the little train. Yep. Should we try one more? Little less staccato. All you guys got a little just one. Think of it more like a staccato quarter note. You know what I mean? Right. Here it is, 147 to 148. So it was exactly a year ago, and it's funny because I was just wrapping Journey, or I guess I had wrapped Journey because it was coming out. But point is, Journey I had worked on for 3 years, and this game showed up, and it was like May 1st or something, and it was like May 25th I had to deliver the finished score. So it had 3 weeks basically to do the whole game. And it was the same amount of music and the same level of production as Journey. So it was, and I was scoring that film with the stalking montage at the same time. So it was, it's a good thing I don't sleep. And because occasionally I'd be really fucked if I needed to. And, so I want to play you one more before I talk about Journey, which is something that has not come out yet. And it's a fun example to use when I say that figuring out how people interpret basic musical gestures and then using them to your advantage when developing your material is really important, because especially for a game like this. So if I play this, does anybody know what it is? Anybody know this? Yes?
I want to say Super Mario, but I'm
Nope.
No.
Leisure Suit Larry. Now, almost all of you were not born yet when Leisure Suit Larry was originally made. Much like the deeply spiritual game like Journey, Leisure Suit Larry is a game about a 40-year-old virgin in Vegas trying to get laid. And it was originally made in 1987, and then they remade it in 91, and then in 2012 they were like, I have an idea, let's remake it again. And to my complete shock, they called me to score it.
Yes.
So they made 7 through the 90s, through about 95 or 96 or something. They made 7 Leisure Suit Larry games, and the first 6 were all 100%, even pre like MIDI, general MIDI playback off the sound card. Like the very first Larry, 1987, was what was called the Tandy, where it was literally the little speaker inside the tower, the box, that could only play one. It had one tone. It was just a tone. It couldn't do like multiple instrument sounds, and but they could do up to 3 voices. So they could do this very literally stuff that you could have to do with 1 or 2 or 3 fingers. And the creator of the game, the programmer and writer for it, Al Lowe, also wrote the theme, and he wrote the music for the whole first game. And it's become kind of an iconic theme, especially people that grew up in the 80s. Everybody knows this piece. And so only Leisure Suit Larry 7 actually technologically could support recorded audio in the game. And so they recorded a little jazz quartet, piano, bass, drums, and sax playing the theme for that one. And so when this one came around, I'm like, well, we gotta blow this up into a whole new thing. And so I did something that I've never done before, which was quite a lot of fun. And you guys are literally the first people who's ever seen this, because it hasn't come out yet. So this is on YouTube. It's not accessible. So yeah, this is on my channel, waiting to be deployed for when the game is actually coming out, because the game isn't out yet. I literally just finished the score.
We're recording this, should we delay the
Oh, you're fine.
that video?
So here's, much like that video for Horn, this is yeah, so you'll hear clicks come in at bar 8 from the top. You good? Mm-hmm. Here it comes. romantic theme in the game that's a variation on his, that I use for the various kind of romantic moments in the game. Actually, I went with like a James Bond approach, you know, where like when you watch James Bond movies, he's clearly this just like mindless sex hound. But John Barry never scored it that way. And that's actually a perfect example of what I was like, you take a movie, like, for God's sake, the movie's called Octopussy. This is what he wrote. He goes, it's super romantic. I mean, that's classic James Bond. They were always like, you know, my favorite was always You Only Live Twice. Like, and so the similar approach to Leisure Suit Larry, where it was like, I want to make it actually seem meaningful to the character, even if it's ridiculous. Yeah.
The romantic theme in Octopussy, if you were the one writing that and you wanted to make it like James Bond is the sex fiend, like you were saying, how would you write that?
How would you make it actually like devious and
Personally, what would you put in there?
I wish I had. There's a new game that I'm not allowed to say what it is that I've started on. That the music that I'm writing for that probably is the answer to your question. But the funny thing is that it totally is out of it. Like it. The part of why I'm writing it is that it makes no sense for that other game. So it makes for a weird juxtaposition, whereas it would be quite at home in what you're saying. So I know that sentence probably has no meaning. What'd you say?
Can we hear a little bit of it on the piano?
It won't. It's not. I mean, you know, it won't play. You know, it's like you need the actual instrumentation that it's written for to really communicate what it is. I don't have it.
So when can we expect that game to drop so that we can?
That we're all listening for.
It's going to be announced. The game has already been announced, but it has not been announced that I am scoring it until E3. And so that's coming up soon. Then all will be revealed. And you'll laugh when you realize, you'll be like, oh, that? But point being, so you understand what I'm saying? Like, the goal is to take an idea and put it through the filter of what is fundamentally you. But you are taking advantage of known ideas. You know, like for me, the use of a big band has an automatic built-in cultural association that I am taking full advantage of, but I'm repurposing it into my own thing. So, all that in mind, that's point number 2. Back 6 hours ago when I finished point number 1, the music's ability to communicate subtext and actual emotional meaning in parallel to the textual meaning is one thing that is how I go about doing what I do. The second thing is understanding these individual points. The next thing is what I already kind of hinted at, which is the importance of actual storytelling itself and of arc. And this is where I like to shift into talking about Journey. What'd you say?
Would there be spoilers?
No. No. To me, Journey, it's funny. I love doing things like Monaco and Leisure Suit Larry, and I've done about 40 films, including like just totally like bad B horror, you know, vampire movies and all kinds of stuff. But a game like Journey is very, very near and dear to my heart, and it was unlike any other experience I've ever had. Like I said, it's 3 years. And so, even though I have a lot of like emotion and intensity wrapped into Journey, all these same principles are still at work. But reason why I say that is, I'm very protective of people's experience with Journey and not trying to color that through any sort of stories of mine. So I will definitely not reveal any spoilers, and don't ask me questions like, what is such and such symbolize, or what is that supposed to mean, or whatever, because to me it's like, there is no answer to that. It's whatever you think, and that was always the idea. So all the little kind of symbolisms and metaphors in the game are meant to be very personal. And so, it was 4 years ago, actually a little more than 4 years ago now, that Flower had just come out. I didn't work on Flower, but I, of course, had like play tested it all throughout and was very kind of deeply invested in it and just in awe of it. And of course, we had done Flow. So then Flower comes out. It's like the greatest game ever. And then Genova calls me again and says, "I'd like to have lunch, or dinner rather." And I remember we met down at this sushi restaurant, and I don't know what I was thinking, because Genova is not the kind of guy that will ever be like, "Hot out there today, isn't it?" God, like he will never bullshit about the weather and stuff like that. He's this extremely intense person that you have to like prepare yourself when you're going to have a conversation with him. And I, of course, I hadn't worked with him since Flow, and it had been a couple years, and so by the time we got to the release of Flower and he wants to get together, I was like out of practice, and so I was like, "Oh, we're just going to have dinner, it's going to be awesome, I can't wait to hear about how he feels about, Flower's release and all that." And so we get together, and it's like 3 minutes into it, I'm like, I should have brought like a laptop or something to this dinner. So I was taking notes. So I literally actually ran to the waitress and had her, how the receipt printers have the eject button. I had her just hold it down and print this long thing because it was the only blank paper they had. But ironically, it actually sort of resembles a Journey scarf, which we hadn't that hadn't been thought of yet in the game. Literally, the game didn't exist yet, but this was our dinner in which he was going to tell me about Journey. And as soon as he started talking, it was like, holy shit! And I started just writing. So I have this I don't even remember where it is, but I have this little piece of paper that's like 6 feet long and 2 inches wide of all my notes from that first meeting. And basically everything that he said is in the final game, even though it took 3 years to make, which was not the original plan, and it changed a ton. Somehow the core idea that he threw to me that day is the game. He talked about, I want it to be a desert landscape where you're walking into the distance, and at the time it was like a cliff that had a big crack in it and eventually became a mountain. So he had 2 goals for this game. The goal with Flow, which I didn't say, other than the dynamic flow theory concept, the other thing was that he wanted the game to be relaxing, which at the time, especially, this was like 2005 or whatever, no one made games that were trying to be relaxing. It was like, that was considered stupid. And it's still largely unexplored. But Genova's whole idea was, if you were to take a color wheel of the human emotional spectrum, and liken it to the human emotional spectrum, all games fit into that 10% of bright red and orange. All your Warcrafts and your Halos and your Call of Duties and your Uncharted and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even Tetris is about the anxiety of doing it right. So all games are about this stimulus. And Genova was like, not all books are like that. Not all movies are like that. Not all music is like that. I want to make games that explore other things. The first thing he wanted to explore was relaxation. But within a game that actually was a game. And of course no one had done that. That's why it was this big success. And so when Journey came around, again,